all to you, but I've got to tell you, they're really rather remarkable. The first panels, let me introduce the first panel. Dr. Scott Lillibridge is Director of the Center for Global Health and Innovation at Texas A&M, former Special Assistant for National Security and Emergency Management at HHS. And what I also think is rather interesting is that he worked with Dr. George on her dissertation.
I did.
And we have promised Dr. Asha George that we weren't going to ask any questions with regard to that project or your presence, but we'll talk to you privately about that.
We still need one final signature.
We're going to have Dr. Randy Murch. Dr. Murch, you're here. Thank you for being here. He's FBI, created the FBI WMD Forensic Investigative Unit. He's been part of the Institute for Defense Analysis, which is an organization I was very privileged to work with for several years, and again has a resume of public service, of effective public service that is well, it's reflective of the quality of men and women we have working on behalf of the public writ large. And let's see, and we have Dr. Cannons. And there's so much of this federal-state partnership that is critical to us. And Dr. Andrew Cannons is the Florida State Public Health Laboratory Director. And you know, you can't really secure the country from inside the Beltway. We got a lot of assets here, but how we distribute the people and the resources and the information down to the states and the locals is how we make the federal system and how we make us all safer. And so we're privileged to have all three of you here. And Dr. Lillibridge, we're going to ask you to start the panel discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. And I appreciate all the work the panel has done. And it's great to hear this continued interest after almost 20 years. For me, I was invited to speak and relate my perspectives on the anthrax adventure, our preparedness, the fits and starts, and biodefense. From my perspective, really the history, the modern history, really started in about 1999. It's when we opened the doors at CDC on the Bioterrorism Preparedness and Response Program. At that time, we had $129 million to start with. It was a lot of money in those days. And we took the idea that we would try to plug vulnerabilities at the state and local level. We would shore up laboratory networks, surveillance, training, awareness, and planning. It was a large program, but wasn't exactly huge by scope, by today's scope and scale. I was greeted at that time by my colleagues who said, why don't I get a real job? It was not the most popular thing at that time. And I remember the naivete of the press and the media and the folks at that time. In the first press conference, they asked me what was our position on smallpox. And I could have said a lot of things about the vaccine development, about immunity, about diagnostics. And I said, we're against it. For which the press went away and wrote it down. And I thought,
I think you have a future in politics.
We're against it. And anyway, despite the initial skepticism, we had a committed group at CDC, and we went to work, and we had some luminaries in government, and we had some champions. I heard that this morning. We had some champions at the time. D.A. Henderson, Mike Osterholm, Tara O'Toole, Phil Russell on the outside. We're pushing hard to sound the clarion call and keep this in the media and public awareness. D.A. Henderson really knew how to market a program. Richard Preston's book was out. This added to an awareness, the hot zone, and we had President Clinton at the time was highly interested in that and began to push towards greater interest in biodefense. In 1999, December, we opened the office at CDC. We were in a hurry. We picked a number of pathogens, not knowing and not having relationships with terrorist organizations to exchange information. We just picked the vulnerabilities, which is way different than picking what's most likely to happen. We looked at the vulnerability of the civilian population. And anthrax and smallpox were at the top of our list, so that it was identification, vaccines, awareness, and so forth. And we began to move on our program. It was about a 3 to 5 year infrastructure building program, and at that time, that sold well to both sides of the aisle, the states and the local health departments, that this was an infrastructure building process. We were going to upgrade labs, surveillance, awareness around a wide range of infectious diseases, and we moved out smartly on that. We were surprised, of course, with when the anthrax happened, but we were glad that that was the first assay we had sent out to the state health departments. It was identified, and many of these were identified at the state and local level. I lived through this with a couple of you in the room, Senator Daschle, Governor Ridge. We had some late night meetings at different places around the Capitol. And I'll just give you kind of my emotional kind of feeling of sort of putting the science, the policy, the agencies together. My role at the time was I was a staff special assistant to the secretary. So it gave me access to various corridors where decisions were made. I was summoned by 2 o'clock in the morning one morning to go to the Hill to brief Senator Daschle and Trent Lott. And I remember saying, are they there? I said, he goes, yeah, they're there. Just go tell them, go brief them. I go, brief them on what? He goes, you know, what's going on? And I said, okay, if I can, let me get there and we'll do this. And I made my way up in the middle of the night and found Senator Daschle and Lott in the room with Sergeant Arms. And we sat down and began to talk through what anthrax meant, how it was spread, what the ramifications were. And in talking, it became clear to me that there was not a serious federal mobilization at that time. The local health department hadn't been notified of all the parameters and exposure. People in the Hart building came from multiple counties and states that day, so we now had people exposed all over the country. And I had this sinking feeling to say, wow, we have really got some gap here in terms of what we have to do in a hurry. We called the Commissioner of Health for the district to come in and notified the Office of Emergency Preparedness, and a couple things began to happen. Sorry about your bags on there, but I hope it all works out. That was a real eye-opener for me, because we had now had multiple agencies. We had cleanup with EPA, we had FBI, we had a forensic investigation, we had state and local health departments involved, and we had civilian populations at risk. And for our standpoint at CDC at that time and HHS was trying to deal with the aftermath rather than the prevention of civilian populations. I remember late night meetings in the White House that stand up, knock down, drag out fights Governor Ridge brokered between HHS and law enforcement about how do you share information at the time of the crisis. At some part, this was a law enforcement investigation that was held in secrecy, and in the other point of HHS, we had a public health emergency where we needed information to make decisions on prophylaxis, medications, and so forth. That was a contact sport. I thank you for brokering those meetings. So where are we, and what do we learn from anthrax? Well, we came out of that thinking a couple things still remain with me, and that is communications is key, and that we were constantly eclipsed by a news cycle that exceeded our ability scientifically or managerially to keep up with the emergency response. For example, I called it the CNN surveillance system. A patient goes to hospital, doctors have a press conference, White House calls HHS, what's going on? HHS calls CDC, and it's completely backwards how it's supposed to work. Actually, you're supposed to get surveillance from the field, and so we were constantly surprised on that. Communications was key. We needed a better way to keep pace with information. And that led us to the next thing, is that we really were not at HHS in many places in government organized in a ICS, Incident Command System, or an operations center. The military and FEMA had done this instinctively, but the other agencies that had to be drawn in were not organized in that fashion. And within a year or two, CDC, HHS, and others kind of evolved into a better system to handle information and validate claims and look at situational awareness. The third thing that's really important was that we validated the initial parts of the program, and that was state and local assistance is extremely important, building capacity. I can't tell you how many times the local physicians and response laboratory response network identified the early case and then substantiated the first range of diagnostics to allow us to begin prophylactic medications to populations. That happened time and time again. It wasn't perfect, but it did show me that the investment in surveillance, laboratory training, and awareness at the state and local health department level was extremely important. And the fourth thing was that this is a crime public health emergency. It's also a strategic emergency. And as Governor Ridge mentioned, we had EPA cleanup, we had the White House involved, we had national security. Virtually, at the end of the day, we had almost every agency involved in some piece of this response. So how have we done with the money and the programs we've done over the last 20 years? I think we've done very well to a certain point. We have got on the beach at Omaha Beach on D-Day, we have broken through, but we have not yet taken Europe. So I think there's a few things that I want to mention that I think are things that we can work on. We have done well in galvanizing constituents of U.S. departments and agencies. However, we face different biologic threats today than we understood in 1999. They are more complex, they are larger in scale, they are more global and strategic than we were thinking 20 years ago. We were thinking about vulnerability to specific agents. We weren't thinking of national scope, synthetic biology, genetic sequencing, manipulation of resistance patterns, and so forth. This has gotten much more complex. So how do we address this, and kind of where are we, some of the challenges that I see coming up? And I was pleased to see some of these in the recent study. It's already been mentioned that one-year funding or intermittent funding just won't do the trick. This is a large-scale operation. 5-10-year programs are going to be needed to build the kind of collective infrastructure that's important in dealing with these kinds of threats. Number two, I don't think we've sufficiently engaged private industry. I think we have a good start, but part of that relates to the scope and scale of the money involved. I don't think we have enough resources invest to attract the best and brightest out of the industry. I still think we're a private enterprise company, and most of the expertise that we need resides in a hybrid of the private sector, academia, and other key organizations around the United States. I don't think we've aggregated our resources sufficiently to really manage our stake with private industry to get them involved. Many of these companies, we lack the political will sometimes to enforce and follow up IP that we own, or to get them to help develop preparedness strategies. Many are multinational that have the vaccines or the antidotes and countermeasures that we need. So it's a very complex thing, but a key to that is really having the political will and sufficient funding to steer industry and get them involved in this. The other thing is that, I just came back from Congo, long enough to be out of the incubation period on Ebola. And it just hit me that, we really don't have America's team. I mean, what we have is, we have a couple Americans in different response groups there. We have a few people working with the UN. But this is fairly interesting for the following reason. This Ebola continues to spread in northern Congo. It's in the area of a conflict zone. Makes it hard to do surveillance and follow-up. it is in some ways perhaps the harbinger of the perfect storm of spreading epidemic that's contagious, that we can't access the population. So it has all the features where national security of the United States has a vested interest, and we on the state side are deeply concerned that it stay and get controlled in Africa. So, and what I mean by this is that, you know, I see we're doing a great job with different agencies and departments building activities, research agendas, and different teams. But what we don't have is a sort of a coordinated thing. We mentioned that before. I doubt that in 1960, 61, we could have got to the moon in 69 had we approached the moonshot with 50 to 20 different agencies that all worked on their own prerogatives, had their own funding, and it wasn't coordinated centrally. I just don't see how we would have done that without a NASA and a central organization, central organized structure to accomplish that goal. So that's one. And the last thing I want to mention is leadership. That comes up a lot is, you know, we've talked about the vice president, we've talked about HHS, we've talked about other agencies periodically or new agencies. To me, you know, after being in the field for more than 3 decades on major outbreaks and standing up the Bioterrorism program, working as the OFDA medical director for the USAID's Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance, what I think the solution for me is more the organization, build the organization rather than to name the responsible party. I'm happy if it's the president, I'm happy or it's the vice president or HHS. But building and funding the proper organization is so critical to get capacity to come out of the spigot when you need these complex things done. So if I were to think ahead what this might look like in the future, I would see that we'd have an organization that was more corporate, perhaps scientific in origin rather than civil service or military, needs to run on an informational backbone like Amazon, IBM, or Microsoft, that's capable of computational biology, genomics, artificial intelligence, as well as able to use blockchain accountability for all packages, medications, and so forth. The size and scope needs to be, I think, more like the Manhattan Project rather than a small program in a discrete agency or department. I think it's going to be overarching. The organizational structure I talked about, the kind of steps that I think would make a difference to me as a bureaucrat, or a former bureaucrat, I would say, is if you don't consolidate biodefense budgets across agencies and departments, or if you do that, 90% of your problem and coordination will be solved. If you give people disparate budgets and autonomy over their budgets, you can't build the pizza if you hand out the slices. While continuing to what works domestically, I think we have to understand that most of the threats that we face are global in nature. They're emerging diseases in faraway places. They are nation-state actors, and we have this new phenomena of manipulation and synthetic biology that can pop up virtually anywhere. And last, I think like NAFTA and taking another stab at redirecting NAFTA and relationships with Canada and Mexico, I think it's time to take a second look at revitalizing components of the UN. We need neutral vehicles to get into regions of the world. Right now, and in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, the UN is doing a great job of coordinating, providing an umbrella for organizations, providing support, putting funding, and managing, keeping their finger in the dike of the outbreak. It's the first time I've really seen the UN become operational. And it gave me hope that probably within the regional framework of the UN, we could probably put some investment with American leadership and get some bang for a buck and get access to a lot of these remote areas. And again, keeping what works domestically on the preparedness side of the states and local areas that we validated with some international traction and ability to respond, I think would be highly important. With that, I think I'll close. I think I've said enough, but those are some of my reflections. And
Wait until the conclusion of all panelists'
Gentlemen, thank you for having me again. It's good to see you. I'm sorry to disappoint that I'm not Doug Anders. I'm here as the grandfather emeritus of the Forensic and Attribution Program of the U.S. and really the world. And what I'd like to do is begin, because I can't possibly address the kinds of points he would and the experience he's had, where the FBI program was and is today. I can provide you some background, which I think is important, but also sort of the then and now. So first of all, this is probably the only program in our National Biodefense program that actually was before. It was not reactionary. It actually began in 1996. We had absolutely nothing at all in the way of forensics and attribution support for biological, but also nuclear and chemical and radiological as well. We actually did create that with the support of Director Free and Attorney General Reno, both very strong advocates and supporters and spokespersons for us. And it was really, the timing was excellent because it was in the lead up to the 1996 Olympic Games. And actually my first co-conspirator in this program is the gentleman to my right when we engaged CDC. How fortuitous that the games were in Atlanta at the time. I actually began thinking about this program in 1981, 1982 as a young agent in the Los Angeles field office working counterterrorism and WMD terrorism as part of my portfolio, hoping that I'd get to the lab someday, and that's why I was hired into the FBI to go to the lab and become a forensic expert. And timing an opportunity came about, as did the revelation of the former Soviet program, Aum Shinrikyo, another bestseller, The Cobra Event by Richard Preston, that was read by President Clinton, and called over to FBI headquarters and asked, what are we doing about this? What do we have that you're doing and building? And we actually had something in motion at the time. That book was based on the program I was building. And also the famous episode with Secretary Cohen holding up a bag of Domino sugar, saying if this were anthrax and got loose, it would kill us all. So those are some of the prompts that really helped us jumpstart the program along with a special event in Atlanta. The initial design of the program was intended to integrate forensic science with a range of scientific disciplines, which are primarily biomedical and more of the traditional sciences, microbiology, virology, epidemiology, and so forth. We also had to be cognizant of and sensitive to the legal requirements, admissibility of novel evidence into the court, of course, through Daubert, which Mr. Weinstein is well acquainted with. We realized back in the late 80s, I did understand that we had some capability in the Department of Energy National Labs, primarily Livermore and Los Alamos. We knew some of the principal scientists there that have since retired and moved on. We understood that there were other capabilities in the U.S. government that we could leverage, including the Department of Defense and some in academia. We knew that we had to, chart a course for increasingly more informative science, and we had to ensure proper forensic validation, which is not what the national labs, the Department of Defense, and academia understands. We actually did early on, in about the 1997 budget year, around in there, attempted to pursue a facility that would be dedicated to this kind of program. That was prohibited by the Marine Corps, who are our hosts at the Quantico Marine Corps base. They didn't want the nasty stuff on their territory, so we were disallowed. However, a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense by the name of Sal Bosco, he was in the ChemBio program, stepped up. He found me, offered support for the Olympic Games, as well as providing access to USAMRIID and the Bethesda Naval Medical Center, and one of their programs there. And so what we have today, that was the background where the roots began. Now we have, from the Hazardous Materials Response Unit created in '96 to the Strategic Response Unit that we have today, is the leading program in the world for forensics and attribution support. Okay. So now let me move into some of the points that were captured in some of the questions that you had that I saw ahead of time, and try to get you from before 1001 through 1001 to now as best as I can relate to you. First of all, we started with the existing presumptive field testing. That's been since discarded. We usually move all the samples. The FBI moves the samples to the laboratory for Presumptive, confirmatory, and deep characterization. That's evolved very quickly through the years with various generations of science and technology and understanding the problem sets they have to deal with. We still leverage clinical methods, especially those in the laboratory response network. I'll get back to that because that was actually a Jerry Parker and Randy Murch idea that CDC and AEPHL took up and ran with. Asha George was heavily involved in that, as was Scott Lillibridge. Where we were years ago, 17 years ago with 1001 and the kinds of assays has progressed to whole genome sequencing with very sophisticated bioinformatics. It's not a one-size-fits-all solution, but it's very much more advanced and informative than it was in the day. Now, the FBI and its cohorts in the federal government are pursuing proteomics as an adjunct to genomics to see if we get deeper characterization toward more precise attribution, source attribution.
What's it called? Sorry, Doctor.
Proteomics.
Proteomics.
Proteomics, studying the proteins that are produced by organisms, which are then translated from the genomics into action molecules, okay, which have probably more information, get deeper and more precise characterization toward attribution. There probably is a need for better integration of biosurveillance, so we understand natural, deliberate, or accidental, better, cheaper, faster, okay, which we're not quite there yet. Scott and I used to wrangle about that from the very beginning. We knew that was a critical component, understanding that as close to time zero as possible. We're better, but we're not quite there yet. And integrating with a forensic investigation. Another priority that's not only that of the FBI, but it's federal partners as well as international partners, is better characterization of plant and marine biotoxins. There are very significant science challenges to that haven't been overcome yet, and they are potential powerful weapons. Something we didn't have before, and I'm not quite sure Doug Andrews could be better discussant for this, is our ability to exploit traditional physical evidence that is contaminated with a bioweapon or chemical hazard. We have that capability today that we didn't have in the past. What is attribution forensically that's validated right now? Fingerprint, human DNA, and so forth is accepted by the courts. But now we have that kind of capability that we didn't have before. And lastly, we've built, for this aspect of it, is providing the scientific basis to establish legitimacy, publication, presentations that are accepted by the scientific community that actually go in as, we'll call it ammunition or support in court that judges decide based on, what does the scientific community know? What does it believe? What does it value? What does it declare legitimate and accepted? We have even publications that I produced with colleagues of mine back in '05 are still being cited today, 13 years later in the scientific literature, believe it or not. Okay. And then actually, important contribution by the National Academies, for example, this document, which was the assessment of the science used by the FBI in the anthrax mailing cases, which is out there, which gives you some sense of what an elite body of scientists looked at, what they understood, what they reported on, and sort of where we were then to where we are today. And actually, one of my colleagues that I worked with in those days, I was the instigator for this. It was actually Dr. Hassel from now at the Department of Defense, who was the head of the FBI laboratory at the time, and one of his colleagues were the ones that championed this with the National Academies. So now, let me move on to another dimension of sort of then to now. I mentioned earlier that we knew that we would have to leverage national partnerships. CDC and the Department of Defense and the Department of Energy were among the first. So Centers of Disease Control was an important one and still is to this day. I'm told that by my FBI colleagues. USAMRIID, Colonel Dave Franz, who many of you know. And I think he was a Lieutenant Colonel. Jerry Parker was the XO in those days, became my first DoD partners, were excellent supporters and advocates for us. The DOE National Labs, I mentioned a couple of them earlier. In addition, Pacific Northwest National Lab, Sandia National Lab, and Savannah River. And Savannah River is primarily on the nuclear side. And then and I mentioned the other ones too, they're still active members. We did have a community group of academics, national lab, and government, which is no longer exists, but was very important in the early days of standing up the capability. Scott mentioned the Laboratory Response Network. That today is a very powerful, very strong element of the forensic investigative and public health partnership that has to be the bulwark for our national program. And I've been told by my FBI colleagues that they work with the LRN every day, usually from the field office level. The National First Responder Community, we reached out to them right away. If we had time, I could tell you some very humorous anecdotes about getting that started. We don't have time for that, but that, I'm told, is actually very robust at a multi-level, federal, state, local, is tested, is exercised. It's also supported by the Joint Terrorism Task Forces, the Weapons of Mass Destruction Coordinators in the field, and the Hazardous Materials Response Teams in the field offices. And unlike then, in 1996, we're operating on the basis of the WMD statutes. We have numerous policies, strategies and policies to support this, from HSPD 10 onward to this day, including the most recent emanation from the White House, the EOP. One thing that we do need to continue to support and advance is use of existing assets. The intelligence community, I'm very familiar with what goes on there, what has gone on in recent years. I was loaned from the university to the Department of Defense to help develop an advanced capability at the front end of what DoD cares about. The general purpose forces need a technical capability for forensics in this area. They don't have it yet, although it was dictated by then Deputy Secretary Ash Carter. You know, this is what we need to do. Somebody needs to do something. Well, we got as far as a chemical and biological con-op, and it never went any farther, much farther than that. The Department of Agriculture, I'm not quite sure where they stand, but they're an important component. We need to take a look at that. And also, with a DoD perspective, not only we need to take a look at from the end-to-end capabilities that DoD has, but also standardizing and optimizing what the civil support teams provide from the National Guard. We have an array of international partnerships that have been created since we started in '96. The Five Eye Partners, you're familiar with those, Canada, US, UK, New Zealand, Australia, the CTTSO, Counterterrorism Technical Support Office at DoD provides support for international workshops that are all government to government and national lab involvement. US State Department has programs where the FBI gets involved. A number of trusted nation-to-nation activities, NATO, and so on. And even today, the United Nations Office of Disarmament Affairs has reached to the FBI, the US Department of State, and other international partners, mainly in Europe, to upgrade the technical analysis capabilities and develop accredited gold standard laboratories with confirmatory labs. And then lastly, I want to address Senator Daschle's comments on attribution. It's also one of my burning campaigns and crusades and challenges, even in the waning years of my career. The science will never quite get you all the way to where you need to be, and that's just always going to be that way. You know that from your legal practice. You can get far down the road, you can eliminate potential sources and include, hopefully, a limited number of potential sources of a weapon, a bit of evidence, or something like that, some probative evidence. I think we can significantly advance our capabilities, but one thing that's not in anybody's report, with all due respect, including your own, is sufficient research support, money. The pittance that the Department of Homeland Security provides, bless their hearts, is not sufficient for an extended campaign of very aggressive support to push science to its ultimate limits for this purpose. So, and the FBI doesn't have much money of its own. Also, the fusion of different sources of information. It's not just science alone that supports attribution. We know that from the legal. We understand the legal system very well, our criminal jurisprudence process, investigation to prosecution to decision. We don't really have that kind of robust framework on the policy side. I've said this before, I'll say it again, till the day I die. We need a robust framework with the supporting elements, integration, and also optimize the reporting of the food chain to the White House and the National Security Council, whoever the decision-making crucible is, to ensure that it is as robust and defensible as possible. And there is some activity going on now in the ODNI, Office of the Director of National Intelligence. We'll see where that goes. The jury's still out. They've just gotten started for the revisit. And actually, a colleague of mine, Seth Karras, that many of you know, has made a proposal to DOD through DITRA, where I have support to help them out on some things, is looking at a commander's attribution framework, decision attribution framework, coming at it from the DOD combatant command perspective. That's it. Thank you.
Thanks. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yes, sir.
Okay, good morning, and thank you for inviting me here to give you the laboratory perspective. And as Senator Daschle mentioned earlier, you remember how you got involved in anthrax 2001, and for me it was the Saturday, October the 6th, after the index case was first identified of inhalational anthrax. At that time, I was actually a professor at the local university.
Is your mic on?
Yeah,
Okay. very good.
sorry.
Get a little closer. Turn it up.
Okay now? I was a professor at the local university, and the lab director at the local public health laboratory in Tampa called me at 5 o'clock in the morning that day to say, we need help. We're anticipating an increase in samples to test. We don't have enough staff. So I got to the lab and got a crash course in how to do the whole processing of these samples. And 12 hours later, we processed about 50 of those samples that day. And that went on for about a month, 2 months. In most public health labs, certainly in Florida, we did about 1,500 samples, all negative, thank goodness. Up in New York, I contacted them before this meeting. They had done about 1,000 in a month or so, and they had actually had positive. So that changes the whole system a lot. So that was my introduction, and I'll go through what we kind of gathered from that those early days. First of all, the sample volume for a public health lab, 30 to 40 a day for weeks, is overwhelming. That can be difficult to maintain and takes a while to get used to. Like I said, New York had the same issue. Other states probably had less, but certainly some states had a lot of samples to deal with. We had limited staff to deal to do this. You're not just processing samples. You got to deal with the telephone. People are calling in. You got to report out the results. So you've got to shift staff around in order to make it all work. We saw an inconsistency in samples submitted back then. We had samples coming in paper bags. We had car parts being delivered, luggage. We even had a mailbox sent to the lab. And if any of these contained spores, then we would have had contamination from the source through transport up to the lab, and it would have been a significant mess. We didn't have standardized protocols back then. In fact, a lot of public health labs, the Tampa one for sure, we were working only with culture. We'd culture the samples, leave them overnight, came back the next day to see what had grown up on the plates. There were a few states like New York trying to bring on PCR and rapid testing. Safety was not great back then. Most public health labs, Tampa one for sure, we did not have biosafety level capability and containment. So we're working under the biosafety cabinet and making use of PPE, our protective equipment. And then reporting out. We didn't have electronic reporting back then. Everything was faxed or called out to the submitter. And that takes time and people. And our communications were not great. We got samples being delivered to the lab. We had no idea they were arriving. They just turned up at the door. I remember we had one cell phone and one pager back then, and that was it. So communications not great back then. When I asked some of my colleagues around the nation before this meeting what they thought about 2001 and what they understood about it, there was an overwhelming sense of isolation for the public health labs. We were dealing with this on our own sort of thing. And that's not to say we didn't know there were other people out there doing things. It's just things seemed to be isolated. The network was not really in place. We had minimal training of our responders at that time in the hospital labs. There'd been little interaction. And so, you know, even though in Florida there had been some training at the hospital lab down in Boca so that very smart physician, did diagnose the possibility of anthrax very quickly. That really was in an isolated case. And the LRN, as was mentioned by my colleague here, was just getting going basically in 2001. So that's how we saw it back then, and what have we done to try to or improve, and how have we improved? Well, the state public health labs as the reference labs in the LRN, we've gone major steps, I think, to improve and make sure things are better at this moment. The LRN did push out standardized protocols to the reference labs. We all now have rapid testing in place. It's molecular testing. It doesn't rely on that slow culture testing. The funding we received allowed our labs to buy equipment and to maintain that equipment. You can't just buy equipment and let it sit. You have to maintain it, you have to run it, you have to operate it. A lot of public health labs receive funding in order to build or renovate biosafety level 3 labs in the public health labs, and we did that in Tampa. We have a very nice public BSL 3 lab there now. Public health labs got dedicated biothreat or biodefense coordinators in their labs now. So they have staff whose job it is to test these powder samples, and that's all they really do. And they're ready and waiting, and they're on 24/7 call. We implemented electronic reporting back to CDC. So that has been put in place. Every time we get a result, it goes back to CDC and is there in real time. And we certainly improved our training. We reached out to the hospital labs and gave them training on how to recognize and refer potential biothreat agents that they might see in clinical specimens. And we reached out to the responders on how to do sample threat assessment in the field and how to collect those samples and how to deliver them to the labs and how to tell us ahead of time samples are on their way. And that's made a significant difference. We don't get paper bags with samples anymore. We don't get mailboxes anymore. In Florida, we get samples in a 1-gallon paint can, and that's how they're delivered. And we train search staff in the laboratory. We have staff ready to go, demobilized, so they can help out if we ever have an increase in samples again. We've definitely improved communications. We've reached out. We've done a lot of relationship building and networking, and that's done with training. It's done through exercises, done with meetings. We reach out to each other. That fear of isolation has gone away. We're not isolated. We're now flexible. I can give you some examples of where this is all shown to be good. They're not bioterrorism events. They're actually national outbreaks, but nature's a very good bioterrorist. We certainly don't know when nature's going to put something on us. So 2009, we had H1N1 come around. The labs were way more prepared than they would have been back in 2001. We had a big increase in samples, but we moved search staff into place. We had electronic reporting, and the public health labs helped each other out. In 2016, certainly in Florida, we saw Zika hit the state. We were doing about 200 tests a week in Tampa. That's a lot more than we would normally be doing. Again, search staff were deployed. We moved everybody around. It actually got to the point where it was too much, and we reached out to CDC, and they helped us. And again, the fear of not being isolated had gone away. And other examples, Ebola, the public health labs were there, ready to test samples. When MERS coronavirus hit, the 2 cases in the United States, one in Florida, one in Indianapolis, they were tested very quickly, and all the contacts were tested very quickly. And I'll give you a story from Minnesota, which actually is an anthrax story. I think this was about 2010, 2011. They actually had a case of inhalational anthrax drive through the state. It was picked up by the clinical labs very quickly, referred to the public health labs, and they were on top of it and got all the partners involved very quickly to show it was not a bioterrorism event, it was a natural case. So the response, I think, is working a lot better now. We do usually have limited staff. Staff are usually our limiting step when we have an outbreak. But we have the equipment usually in place. We are prepared for what might be around the corner. As I think was mentioned earlier, the powder samples have not gone away. Just last week, Tampa tested 4 powder samples that came through. The process is seamless. Everyone calls up. The samples are delivered, testing is completed in about 4 to 6 hours, reported out, and it's all very much better in place. So we are, I think, in a better place. We had significant funding over the last few, since 2001, that has sort of gone down to sustainment. It supports about 80% of the lab preparedness activities across the nation, but we can respond to those outbreaks, not just the powders. We do have competent staff. They're very well trained. They know what they're doing. We have well-maintained equipment in the labs, and we certainly have better communications and data reporting out to partners like CDC. We're now engagement and partnerships with the FBI, law enforcement, the responders, the civil support teams, clinical labs, and definitely our other public health labs and CDC. So I think I'll finish there and say I think we are in a much better place than we were 17 years ago.
Thank you. I'll go to my colleagues first. Senator Dausch, you care to make some questions? I've got a couple of weeks till the end. Joe, you're next.
Thank you. I'll be respectful of our time. I know we have a limited amount of time. Dr. Lillibridge, first of all, just thank you for your service and for the commitment that you've made to these many, many challenges we face, continue to face, but your commitment and leadership is deeply appreciated. Could you just elaborate a little bit more on the protocol that exists today with regard to a situation similar to what we experienced in 2001? Could you maybe elaborate as to just what would be the protocol for a situation were it to occur again?
All right, it's been a long time since I've been in government, so I can tell you the steps conceptually you have to go through. How they're wired right now between agencies, that's probably more topical than my experience, immediate experience. The first thing is really, what is it? When somebody has a threat of a disease and then presents as a patient or a sample, is to identify what it is. That creates a cascade largely based on clinical observation and supported by laboratory technology. The tools in the toolkit now allow us to look at rapid diagnostics based on DNA, RNA, to look at other attributes, to use sophisticated technology to quickly look at strain and isolate those. Once that happens, it goes into a system where you have alerting into a state or a federal kind of cascade to respond, depending on the circumstances, whether it's deliberate or accidental, or you don't know. A lot of these, as Dr. Murch mentioned, we don't know at first, and that's a really uncomfortable position to be in. The way response organizations, including CDC, FEMA, and DHS, and others is that at that level, things begin to move forward if it's a significant national threat. Stockpile, emergency operations centers are activated, key staff are identified that are subject matter experts, state health departments and laboratories are brought online to update either protocols or get situational awareness, and then briefings go up the political and functional ladders of department agencies and departments. Anybody else who wants to elaborate should do so, but
Dr. Murch, I see you're going to respond to this, but since you're going to be talking, could you just elaborate, in addition to answering or further elaborating on Dr. Lillibridge's remarks? You mentioned the need for the need for money is really one of your vital concerns as you look at research and the way we could address these challenges going forward. Could you drill down a little bit more with regard to what we would do with that money? What would be your priorities?
Sure.
But I'd love to get your comments first on the.
Let me sort of attach myself to Dr. Lillibridge's comments really quickly. Is I do know from recent conversation with my FBI colleagues that ones that are currently on active duty and working the problem set, is that there actually is, unlike in the past, a very rigorous protocol for an assessment of a potential event. And this is used with a amalgam of the various components at FBI headquarters and other agencies. And there's a very rigorous stepwise process they go through to say yay or nay, is it a concern or not? And that's done in a network fashion within and between agencies. So that didn't exist in the past. With respect to the money, and I'm not a big believer in just throwing money at a problem. I didn't grow up that way, and never really lived that way in the Bureau, being held accountable for every dollar we ever got, even for new programs. However, I think that there have been a number of activities, including international meetings. One that comes to mind, I actually helped get going with the National Academies. It was held in Zagreb, Croatia, in the fall of 2013, which resulted in a National Academy report that laid out what an international roadmap for research and development should look like. I do know, because I'm called back in to help the federal government and international partners think through the priorities for research and development they have. They have those in mind. They have very specific things they're looking to do. And they include such things, as I mentioned, having better exploitation of biotoxins. They present very difficult problem sets. They can identify it often, but they can't go very far in the attribution, source attribution. Another one is complex samples. We saw in the anthrax mailing cases that very few of those were pristine samples. They're environmental samples that are cluttered with other microbes, with other genomes, with other background. How do you sort that out? For example, it's one thing if you have a lot of something you're interested in against a background of minimal components, where you think that's the one you're looking for, versus a single copy of a genome in a sea of noise. And what is the significance of that? And that's what we struggle with in these kinds of cases. So in some cases, the samples may be irrelevant. What happens, for example, if that threat agent is in background anyway? Will it be there? So how do you make sense of that? So being able to look at cluttered samples, environmental samples, metagenomics, which is the very difficult, complex genomic samples, as well as better, perhaps, integration of biosurveillance and forensic data would be another one, perhaps. I'm a dreamer and sometimes, and I'd like to see what could machine learning or AI do for us that we haven't explored yet. There's a recent report that came out. I haven't had a chance to read it, but someone is looking at how one might attribute samples to a laboratory using AI and machine learning. It just came out. I haven't had a chance to read it, but I'll happy to share it with Dr. George, and you can then have a look at it and see what people are beginning to explore. So those are some of the examples, and I think there are probably some basic things that are we'll call it not, very difficult from off the shelf that we haven't got a chance to look at. The other thing is the unknown unknown. One last shot at this, since you gave it to me, is the unknown unknown, so that we can reduce surprise. Synthetic biology and what that generated of threats, how do we tackle that from a forensic perspective?
Very helpful. Thank you.
One comment on funding on there. The way we engage industry really has been through BARDA in the public health and medical realm. It is really critically important that have substantial funding and longer-term funding if you're going to bend industry towards strategic goals.
Well said. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks to the three of you. Excellent panel. Dr. Lillibridge, you mentioned in your remarks that really we ought to be trying to involve private enterprise, private sector more in the biodefense of our country. Just spell that out a little more detail. It may be something we want to focus on in the months ahead.
If you look at the way technology is organized in the United States, the biopharma, the biotechnology, the innovation is largely in the private sector.
Right.
We need to harness that for our goals of biopreparedness. The way we do that is longer-term programs, financial. We have interlocking directorates where we have some shared equities between industry and the public. We call those public-private partnerships. I think in this country, the way we do business, those are extremely important. My concern in the past is if we build sort of parallel capacities in lots of agencies, we won't have the scale and depth to approach and bend industry into cooperating with us.
So are you thinking mostly of creating greater incentives to the private sector for countermeasures, or is it beyond that? I mean,
You know, I think
do we have anything to learn from them on infrastructure, the reform or improvement of our biodefense infrastructure?
You know, I think we do. And what I used to think naively 20 years ago was that more funding to buy more things from industry. Now I'm thinking of greater funding to bring industry into part of the preparedness effort, much like when we designed bombers in World War II. We had the Army Air Corps work with Boeing and Douglas and others to refine an airplane that could get funded and could work effectively. We're not engaging up front strategically as much as we should.
Okay, I'd like to continue that discussion with you. I do want to say that one thing that came out from your testimony that was interesting to me is that as much as we look back at the response to the anthrax attacks of 1001 and say, wow, could have been, we should have done a lot better. What's interesting is that there actually was some infrastructure already in place. That you had begun something at CDC, you've been the FBI, in some sense your labs were ready to respond to the attack. So I don't, we only have less than 10 minutes, but what motivated those early actions? You mentioned that President Clinton read a book and called and asked what you were doing about it, but it must have been more than that.
You know, if you go back at that time, there was a group of luminaries, and I mentioned these champions, probably D.A. Henderson at the head of the list, but certainly others. There were several people in Congress, including yourselves, who had an interest in this area. The president, the public, and the entertainment industry had brought this to great awareness of the public. We had a lot of through movies and books
TV
and,
shows,
Hot Zone, Cobra, and
Right.
so forth. There was a lot of awareness at the time, and you know, we benefited at that time to begin what was a nascent program with, by today's standards, relatively low amounts of money and resources, to begin the process of beginning to implement a laboratory response network. Randy and his group and our group at CDC at the time had developed a way to work together at the local level and regional level. We hadn't done that at the national level yet necessarily, but I think those were all the implementation factors at that time.
Okay.
We
It's
had
a lot
something to build
learn
on.
from that. Thanks.
Thanks, Randy. I want to follow up on the. I know this is about sort of today's events, but the National Bioforensic Analysis Center. So my understanding is there was this memorandum of agreement. I think Senator Daschle mentioned it this morning between HHS and FBI. FBI is now managing it, or DHS and FBI. FBI is now managing it. Do you have a sense of how that's going? Sort of, you know, whether that transition has gone smoothly or not, and then do you have any recommendations for maybe how to sort of help advance the mission going forward? We talked, I think Senator Daschle mentioned maybe specific authorization, appropriations, legislatively, et cetera.
So I'm sort of the innocent bystander sitting up in the stands on this one, but I do have had a number of conversations with newsflash updates from my FBI colleagues. So I knew at one time there was a discussion that the FBI was going to take over management of all of it, all of NBFAC, and apparently that's been reduced back to the part that matters most to them, and that's NBFAC. And watching the evolution of NBFAC over the years, which I've been pretty close to, and I do speak with Jim Burns, for example, on a regular basis. I see him at conferences and so on. I think it's gone very well, to be honest with you. I've been very encouraged, not simply by the evolution of the technical capability, but the coordination, and also the understanding that The FBI is the primary customer. It is the director of activity. There are other federal agencies that use it, but very sparingly because of need. In my view, and this is also coming from Doug Anders, who I did email with over the weekend, is that we do think that there's a couple of enterprises that could take better advantage of it. And that would also infuse resources. One is the intelligence community, and two is the Department of Defense. The Department of Defense needs a global forward projected capability. It does have some of that. It doesn't have all of it, but it also would need a confirmatory laboratory. Why not use NBFAC? It is the so-called gold standard national lab. And I think that I do know with very good certitude that what the IC has been using it for, I think there's more to be done there. And we'll just leave it at that for the time being. I think that also, largely because of funding resources, as I understand it, I think there's probably value to get back to more of a research support network there was one created in the early days with companies and universities that shrunk to some of the national labs that support NBFAC, and they can do some work there for R&D and transition, but not as much. Probably revisiting that, for example. And I really think there's a natural trajectory that could be envisioned, provided other federal assets, federal departments and agencies, enterprises would take more advantage, and we'd be in better shape than we are.
My colleagues, ex officio members have a question?
I had
Dr.
one
Troy?
quick question for Dr. Lillibridge. Thank you for all of you for your presentations. Dr. Lillibridge, you mentioned the potential of blockchain to help in preparation for bioterror attacks. I'm a big fan of blockchain. I've written about its potential, but I'd love to hear a little more elaboration of how it could work in this area.
Yeah, well, thanks. Thanks for your work and interest. As I think about the future, the next big response that I'm in or get involved with or you get involved with, this is going to be information intensive. We heard from Randy and others about lab, sequencing data, surveillance data, information, logistics, moving, stockpile, and so forth. And we have got what we have is a huge informatics activity. It's large scale. It's beyond what we could do on paper back in 2001. It requires a major informatics backbone. And I mentioned Amazon, IBM, and Microsoft. We've worked with all three. They all have their pluses and minuses. But as you begin moving logistics, people, and responding to populations, there's a lot of things in motions. And we have to have signatures, attribution, and a situational awareness of all these pieces. A blockchain is a tool that would be used to supplement how we manage an information-intensive emergency. We're using it in biodefense, on our ag biodefense, tracking of livestock. We use it to manage lab samples, and we're going to use it to get signatures on sequencing.
Anything else? Dr. Cannons, I don't mean to put you on the spot to speak for the entire public health community, but indulge me, if you will. Part of it probably has to do with my perspective, privilege to serve both in Washington in a couple capacities, but as governor. But I don't think we'll ever be as strong as a country if we think we can get everything done in Washington. It is a federal system, so I'm going to ask you a question. From your perspective in Florida, maybe you can speak just for yourself, in terms of setting protocols among the 50 states consistent with what maybe the federal government would accept as a norm, so we don't have this duplication of labs. FBI is doing something, you're doing something, CDC is doing something. Everybody's got to be testing the same thing. So in terms of standardizing protocols, communicating information, and even supporting with funding, how do you view the situation today? Forget about 9/11. That time period in 9/11, everybody says everything's much better. I'm just trying to figure out how much better, because from my perspective, 9/11 couldn't have been much worse, because you had multiple pieces of infrastructure, but even then they had a tough time with protocols and communication. So, but particularly from the federal down to the state level, information, protocol, and even funding. Would you care to comment in those three areas? I told you I'd put you on a spot. If you,
Yeah, thank
maybe
you.
just from a Florida perspective, then you don't have to speak for the whole industry.
I think it is a tough question, I think, to answer. I mentioned some of our responses to major outbreaks that we've had, and that was, I believe, better than it would have been prior to 2001 because of the infrastructure that was put into place. So that's one example that we have moved on. We do, and I hear, about doing whole genome sequencing and advancing the technology that way. One of the things that we have the ability to look for things we're trying to detect. We don't have the ability to look for the unknowns, and that's what's been mentioned. And I think that's where we are lacking. Now, the public health labs, we don't have the resources usually to develop our own methods. We're going to get them, the standardized methods, from CDC, and CDC is also working with the Department of Defense. They can push out methods very quickly. But we do need to be proactive and not reactive with some of these methods. And from my perspective, whether it's Florida or another state, I think we do rely heavily on what we get given to test our protocols, our methodology. So we're going to develop that. We're going to work with what we're given very quickly, but we are relying on that information to come down to us and those protocols. But I think the examples we've seen, how we've responded is so much better. But yes, we've got to move to the next level, and I don't know what that takes for the public health lab, other than very competent staff, equipment, and the ability to respond.
I appreciate. My colleagues care to? Yeah. That's, sometimes a good answer, no. And my colleagues in government will probably tell you sometimes the worst question when they say any more questions is the last one. And they wish they wouldn't have said any more questions. But any additional response, any thoughts there? I just think it's so critical in this whole area for there to be so much, the collaboration, the communication between the federal and the state. Thank God we had individuals back on 9/11 that responded. I mean, you showed up at 2 o'clock in the morning. I mean, I understand that, but it's got to be an ongoing, it almost has to be institutionalized as to how the feds deal with the state public health community. And I'm not sure it is. Yeah. That's what the question I was asking.
I had two observations that help deal with federal, state, and disparate third parties on there. And one was the laboratory is a common language for us, and that made it easy to go forward with the laboratory response network. You heard Randy talk about the FBI working with the state and working with foreign entities. It's an easy way to collaborate. I'm looking for wins like that in biodefense, and information technology was another one. Common surveillance is another language. So I'm thinking these are all extremely important, and I certainly agree with my colleagues.
Well, on behalf of the panel, I want to thank you for your testimony. It's reassuring to know that we made some progress since that anthrax crisis, and frankly, probably one of the reasons we have is so many of you were involved back then. You still have your eye on the prize, eye on the target. So we thank all of you for. Folks, here's what we're going to do. We're going to take a little break now. I'm going to let you get a little lunch, and then we have a video prepared for you where you're consuming lunch, a little intellectual food for thought. And then we're going to be back here at about 20 to 1. We've got a very special speaker at 20 to 1. We're running a few minutes late. I'm accountable. We'll try to get you back on schedule. And to our panel, thank you again very much.
Thank you.
So where the heck are you now these days anyway?
You're in Texas, right? I'm Texas A&M. Right?
Oh, okay.